Most people head into the wilderness to disconnect. No emails, no traffic, no endless notifications. That's the entire point, isn't it? We crave the silence. But isolation is a double-edged sword. While you're cutting yourself off from the rest of the world, you're also cutting yourself off from anyone who could ever hear you scream. Welcome back to Midnight Narrative, where we dig into the dark corners of the world to bring you the stories people were never meant to tell. Before we dive in, take a second to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below. What's the most isolated place you've ever stayed? And did you ever feel like you weren't truly alone? Let me know. I read every single comment. Tonight we have 3 stories submitted by listeners who went looking for peace and quiet. What they found instead was something they've never been able to fully explain or forget. And I warn you, the second story might just make you lock your doors twice tonight. Grab a cold drink, turn off the lights, and let's begin. The first story takes us deep into the thick pine-covered ridges of the Blackwood Mountains in Western Virginia. I'd driven up alone on a bitter Thursday evening in late October. My uncle had offered me the family cabin after I mentioned I needed 2 weeks with 0 distractions. I was grinding through the final revisions of my master's thesis, and my apartment in the city was surrounded by endless road construction and loud neighbors. The cabin was roughly 3 hours north of where I lived. The nearest town, a tiny dot on the map called Oak Haven, was a 20-minute drive down a washboard gravel road that dissolved into pure dirt for the last 3 miles. Once you arrived, there were no neighboring properties for at least 2 miles in any direction. My uncle walked me through the place via a quick phone call before I lost signal. 1 small bedroom, a cramped kitchen, a bathroom, and a main living area centered around a heavy cast iron wood stove. There was 0 cell service inside the log walls. My uncle told me that if I stood on the edge of the front porch and held my phone toward the ridge to the north, I might get a single bar of 3G if the weather was clear. The cabin did have an old beige landline phone sitting on the kitchen counter. My uncle had pinned a yellow sticky note next to it with the direct line to the county volunteer fire department. He had dropped off the keys earlier that week, letting me know he'd be out of state for the month. I unlocked the heavy oak door around 4 p.m., unpacked my food, built a roaring fire in the stove, and sat down at the wooden kitchen table with my laptop. By 8 p.m., I was completely locked into my work. It felt like absolute paradise. Around 9:30 p.m., I stretched my arms, grabbed my empty soup bowl, and walked into the kitchen to wash it. I distinctly remember turning on the tap and looking at the wooden drying rack next to the sink. The rack was completely empty. I know this because I specifically noticed how clean my uncle had left the place. It was one of those small, meaningless mental notes you make without thinking. Empty rack. I scrubbed my bowl, placed it upside down in the rack to dry, and walked back to the table to keep typing. At 11:15 p.m., I stood up to grab a glass of water before heading to sleep. I walked into the kitchen, flipped on the overhead yellow bulb, and froze. Sitting right in the center of the wooden dish rack was a thick ceramic coffee mug, dark burgundy with a chipped handle. My soup bowl was gone. The mug wasn't just tossed there. It was placed right side up, perfectly centered, as if someone had washed it and set it down with care. I stood there in the dead silence of the kitchen, staring at that mug. A cold prickle spread across the back of my neck. I opened every single kitchen cabinet, my heart starting to patter against my ribs. I looked on top of the fridge, in the trash can, under the sink. My bowl was nowhere to be found. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself I must have put the bowl away in some weird hypnotic state of fatigue. I'd been working for 14 hours straight. I was exhausted. I must have moved on autopilot, taken out a mug for coffee I forgot to pour, and stashed the bowl somewhere stupid. It was the only explanation that kept my hands from shaking. So, I committed to it, shut off the lights, locked the heavy front door, and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up at dawn, walked into the kitchen to make coffee, and my stomach dropped into my floorboards. My soup bowl was sitting right there in the dish rack, side by side with the burgundy mug. I immediately grabbed my phone, walked out onto the icy front porch and held it high toward the northern ridge until I caught a flickering bar of signal. I dialed my uncle. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you leave a burgundy mug with a chipped handle in the dish rack?" "A what?" my uncle replied, his voice muffled by static. "No, I don't own a mug like that. All my dishes are plain white stoneware." "Is there anyone else who has a key to this place?" I asked, looking back at the dark windows of the cabin. "No," he said firmly. "There are only 2 keys in existence. One is in my pocket right now in Florida, and the other one is the key I gave you. The front door has a deadbolt, and the back door locks from the inside. Are you sure you didn't just misplace it? You sound stressed, kid." "Yeah, maybe," I lied, wanting desperately to believe him. "I'm just tired." I spent the second day trying to convince myself I was suffering from severe sleep deprivation. I worked at the table, but my eyes kept darting toward the dark tree line outside. Around noon, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped down into a dense, overgrown hollow. About 70 feet from the back porch stood an old, weathered wooden shed. It had a heavy brass padlock hanging from a latch on the double doors. I walked up to it, saw the lock was secured, and assumed my uncle used it for lawnmowers and firewood. I turned around and went back inside. That evening, the subtle disturbances escalated. At 8 p.m., I stepped away from the table to use the bathroom. When I came back out, my laptop screen was dimmed, and my yellow legal pad, which I had left neatly aligned on the right side of the table, was sitting on the far left edge. The pen I had been using was gone entirely. I searched the main room frantically for 20 minutes. I finally found the pen sitting horizontally across the narrow windowsill above the kitchen sink, a place I hadn't gone near all night. That was the moment the denial snapped. Someone was playing with me, or someone was in the cabin with me. I went into survival mode. I checked every single window in the building, all latched tightly from the inside. The front door was locked, and I slid the heavy iron security chain into place. The back door was locked and dead-bolted. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the wood stove and walked through every square inch of the cabin. I searched the small closet. I looked under the frame of the twin bed. Nothing. The cabin was tiny. There was literally nowhere for a human being to hide. I went back to the living room, sat on the edge of the sofa with the iron poker resting across my knees, and watched the front door. At precisely 10:43 p.m., I heard it. Footsteps. They didn't come from the dirt driveway, they came from the wooden planks of the front porch right outside the door. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Step, step, step. Then total silence for 10 agonizing seconds. Step, step. I sat so still I felt like my heart was going to burst through my chest. My hands were slick with sweat on the cold iron poker. The front door had a narrow, frosted glass pane running down the center. As I stared at it, a dark, motionless outline slid across the glass. Someone was standing on the porch, inches away from the wood, staring straight at the frosted glass. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I sat frozen for 90 seconds that felt like 90 years. I waited for the knob to turn. I waited for the glass to shatter. Then, without a sound, the shadow shifted and vanished from the pane. I didn't hear them walk back down the wooden steps. I just sat in total darkness for the rest of the night, holding that iron rod until my knuckles turned white, too terrified to move across the room to use the landline phone. I eventually collapsed from pure exhaustion around 5 a.m., sleeping right there on the sofa. When the morning light finally cut through the windows, I sprinted to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped outside with the iron poker raised. The porch boards were dusty, but near the outer edge, where rain had dripped off the roof, there was a patch of wet clay. Embedded in that clay were deep, muddy boot prints. They were massive, far larger than my size 10 sneakers. I tracked the prints. They didn't lead down the front steps toward the road. They led around the side of the cabin, hugging the log wall, heading straight down the slope toward the wooden shed in the hollow. I walked down the muddy hill, my heart hammering in my ears. When I reached the shed, the brass padlock was still hanging from the metal latch. It looked completely secure. But as I leaned in closer, I noticed something wrong with the metal plate screwed into the rotting wood frame. The heavy steel screws holding the hinge had been completely backed out. The entire latch mechanism could be lifted off the frame like a trapdoor, bypassing the padlock entirely. I reached out with a trembling hand, grabbed the metal plate, and pulled the door open. The smell hit me first: stale sweat, damp wool, and canned meat. Inside the windowless shed was a small setup: a thick winter sleeping bag laid out over a foam pad, a battery-powered lantern, 3 empty cans of beans, a duffel bag stuffed with dark clothing, and right there, hanging on a small brass cup hook screwed directly into the wooden door frame, was a silver key. I picked up the key, walked up to the back door of the cabin and inserted it into the deadbolt. It turned with a smooth, familiar click. Whoever had been living in that shed had a master key. They had been watching me through the windows. They had been walking into the cabin while I was asleep, or while I was sitting right there in the next room with my headphones on, just to move my things, swap my dishes, and let me know they could touch me whenever they wanted. I didn't pack my bags. I ran to my car, slammed it into drive, and tore down that dirt road as fast as the engine would take me. When I reached Oak Haven, I called my uncle from a gas station payphone, and he contacted the county sheriff. By the time the deputies drove out to the property 3 hours later, the shed had been completely cleared out. The clothing, the food, and the key were gone. All that remained was the empty sleeping bag and the stripped screws on the door frame. They never identified the person living 70 feet from my back door. My uncle demolished the shed a week later and sold the property at a massive loss. What haunts me to this day isn't just that someone was in the cabin with me. It's their patience. They had a key. They had total access. They watched me sleep. They could have done anything they wanted to me, but they chose to just sit in the dark, playing games, waiting for something I'll never understand. If that story gave you chills, take a second to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these dark tales. Now, our first story was about a human predator lying in wait, but our second story, submitted by a viewer named Marcus, takes a much darker paranormal turn, because sometimes the thing invading your cabin doesn't leave boot prints. Marcus had rented a small isolated A-frame cabin deep in the dense forests of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, near a tiny, forgotten logging town called Pine Ridge. It was early November, right when the autumn leaves had rotted into the mud, and the air carried that bitter, metallic sting of impending snow. Marcus was an artist, looking to spend a week alone working on a series of charcoal drawings. The A-frame was built in the 1970s, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows on the front wall that looked out into an endless wall of towering pine trees. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The property owner, an elderly man who lived an hour away, had left the key inside a lockbox on the porch. The interior of the A-frame was rustic and dark. The living room was dominated by a large open brick fireplace, and a narrow spiral staircase led up to a loft bedroom that overlooked the main floor. The first night was completely uneventful. Marcus built a fire, drank some whiskey, and fell asleep in the loft. It was on the second night that the rules of reality began to bend. Marcus was sitting at the wooden dining table downstairs around 11 p.m., sketching by the light of a single halogen lamp. The rest of the A-frame was bathed in deep shadow. Out of nowhere, he heard a sound coming from the loft directly above his head. Creak, creak, creak. It sounded precisely like the heavy, rhythmic shifting of weight on the old pine floorboards upstairs. Marcus froze, his charcoal pencil hovering above the paper. He looked up at the ceiling. The cabin was solid wood. Every sound resonated through the structure. "Hello?" he called out. his voice sounding thin and hollow in the open space. The creaking stopped instantly. Marcus stood up, grabbed a heavy flashlight, and walked to the base of the spiral staircase. He shone the beam up into the dark loft. The bed was made. His luggage was sitting neatly in the corner. Nothing was there. He laughed it off, assuming the temperature drop outside was causing the old wood to settle. He went back to his drawing. 20 minutes later, he heard it again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the loft. It was coming from the kitchen area, just 10 feet behind him. Tap, tap, tap. It was the unmistakable sound of fingernails tapping rapidly against the stainless steel kitchen sink. Marcus spun around in his chair, sweeping the flashlight beam across the kitchen. The counters were bare, the sink was dry, but as the beam swept across the polished chrome faucet, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was a thick, fogged patch of condensation on the glass of the kitchen window, as if someone were standing right inside the kitchen, leaning face first against the glass, breathing heavily. And as Marcus watched, terrified, a long, thin drag mark formed in the center of the condensation, as if an invisible finger were slowly drawing a line through the moisture. Marcus backed away from the kitchen until his spine hit the brick fireplace. "Who's there?" he screamed, his breath hitching in his chest. Suddenly, the ambient temperature in the room plummeted. The air became so cold that Marcus's breath began to plume into white clouds right in front of his face. The fire in the brick hearth, which had been roaring seconds before, instantly died down to a dull, smokeless ember. Then came the voice. It didn't come from the kitchen. It didn't come from the loft. It felt like it was originating from inside, the floorboards directly beneath his feet. It was a wet, raspy, multi-layered whisper, like two people speaking the exact same words at the same time, slightly out of sync. "Leave the door open." It slurred. "It's cold out here." Marcus lost his mind. He scrambled toward the front door, unlocked the deadbolt, and grabbed the brass handle. As soon as he pulled the door open an inch, an incredible force slammed it back shut from the outside. The heavy oak door struck his shoulder so hard he was thrown onto the hardwood floor. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, looking up at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Standing on the front porch, pressed entirely flat against the glass, was a figure. It was impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, and utterly featureless. It looked like a silhouette of a man, but its skin was a dull, bruised gray, stretched tightly over a visible skeletal frame. It had no hair, no ears, and no clothes. Where its eyes should have been, there were only deep, hollow sockets filled with thick black liquid that dripped down its sunken cheeks. Its mouth was split open in an unnatural, jaw unhinged wider than human grin, revealing rows of jagged brownish teeth. The entity raised its long, emaciated hands and began to drag its fingernails down the glass of the window. Screech. The sound was unbearable, like metal grinding on metal. Inside the cabin, the floorboards began to violently vibrate. The heavy wooden dining table shifted 3 feet across the floor on its own. The overhead light fixture swung wildly back and forth, casting horrific, chaotic shadows across the walls. From every corner of the cabin, the raspy, dual-toned voice began to scream from within the walls. "Let us in! It's cold out here, let us in!" Marcus didn't think. He didn't grab his wallet, his jacket, or his keys. He sprinted toward the back door near the kitchen, threw the deadbolt, and threw his body weight against it. The door burst open into the freezing night air. Marcus sprinted into the pitch-black forest, bare-chested and barefoot, plunging through the snow and thick briars, ignoring the sharp rocks slicing his feet. Behind him, he could hear the sound of heavy, unnatural thudding, like something massive leaping through the treetops, following him from above. He ran blindly through the woods for nearly 2 miles until he stumbled onto the paved county highway. A passing snowplow driver saw him bleeding, hypothermic and screaming in the middle of the road, and pulled him inside the warm cab. When the county sheriff investigated the A-frame the following afternoon, they found the cabin completely untouched from the outside. But inside every single piece of furniture, the sofa, the dining table, the bed from the loft, had been systematically smashed into splinters and piled into a massive, neat pyramid in the center of the living room floor. Written on the main wall in deep, gouged scratches was a single sentence: "We are still waiting." Marcus never returned to Pine Ridge. He underwent 3 surgeries to repair the nerve damage in his feet from the frostbite, but the mental scars run far deeper. To this day, he cannot sleep in a room with wooden floorboards, and he keeps every light in his house on from sunset to sunrise. If you are enjoying these stories, make sure to join our growing community by subscribing to Midnight Narrative. We drop new, terrifying stories every single week, and you don't want to miss what we have in store for next time. Now let us move on to our third and final story, a slow, agonizing burn that takes place not in the woods, but on the eerie, open waters of a private northern lake. The cabin my wife, Sarah, and I rented sat on the isolated eastern shore of Lake Oconee, deep in the dense wilderness of northern Wisconsin. When the rental listing advertised the property as completely secluded, it wasn't an exaggeration. The nearest paved road was over 7 miles away. The local management company emailed us explicit instructions to download offline GPS maps before entering the county, as all cellular signals completely vanished 15 miles before you reached the turnoff. We arrived on a humid Friday afternoon in late July. The cabin was a beautiful, renovated cedar plank structure featuring a massive wooden deck that extended directly over the water. The lake itself was small, maybe a 1/4 mile across at its widest point, surrounded by an impenetrable wall of old-growth pine trees on the opposite shore. There were no other cabins, no docks, and no signs of human life anywhere on the water. We unpacked our bags, cooked a quiet dinner on the deck, and watched the sun dip below the horizon. Out there, away from city lights, the darkness descended fast and thick, like a heavy black velvet blanket dropping over the lake. Around 10 p.m., Sarah went inside to bed. I stayed out on the deck for a while longer, enjoying the crisp night air and listening to the soft lap of water against the wooden pilings. At 11:45 p.m., I stood up to head inside. As I reached for the sliding glass door, something caught my eye on the far shore of the lake. Directly across the black water, through the thick timber, a light appeared. It was small, yellow, and stationary. It looked like the faint glow of a kerosene lantern or a campfire sitting near the water's edge. I watched it for 10 minutes. It didn't flicker or move. Assuming it was a wild camper who had hiked into the state forest, I paid it no mind, locked the door, and went to bed. The next morning was bright and clear. I took a pair of high-powered hunting binoculars out onto the deck and scanned the opposite shore. There was nothing there. No tent, no smoke, no fire pit, no flattened grass. Just an unbroken, dense wall of pine trees hanging over the dark water. We spent Saturday kayaking, swimming, and relaxing. At no point during the day did we hear a motorboat, a voice, or a single splash from across the lake. That night, around 11:30 p.m., Sarah was already asleep in the bedroom. I turned off the main living room lights and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass windows facing the lake. The light was back. It was sitting in the exact same spot on the opposite shore, but this time I brought my binoculars to the window. I raised the lenses, focused the dial, and felt my stomach drop. It wasn't a campfire. It wasn't a lantern. It was a narrow, high-powered LED beam, and it wasn't pointed up at the sky or down at a campsite. The light was aimed directly across the water, locked precisely onto the windows of our cabin. I adjusted the focus slightly, trying to see who was holding it. In the faint ambient halo of the beam, I could faintly make out the silhouette of a human figure standing at the edge of the water. They were holding the light perfectly still, mounting it on what looked like a tripod, staring straight across the 1/4 mile of black lake into our living room. Because our interior lights had been on earlier, whoever was standing in those trees had been watching every single move Sarah and I had made all evening. My heart began to beat wildly against my ribs. I immediately closed the heavy blackout curtains, woke Sarah up, and told her what I'd seen. She tried to convince me it was probably just a local park ranger or a hunter, but I couldn't sleep a wink. I sat in the dark living room with a kitchen knife in my hand, staring at the seam of the curtains until dawn. Sunday morning brought a heavy, suffocating fog that hung low over the lake. Around noon, Sarah walked down to the dock to unlock the kayaks. A few seconds later, I heard her call my name. I ran down to the wooden dock. Sarah was standing near the edge, pointing at the two hard-shell plastic kayaks we had pulled completely out of the water the night before. When we went to sleep, both kayaks had been sitting side by side, parallel to the cabin deck. Now, one of the kayaks had been rotated 90 degrees. It was lying flat on the wooden planks, pointing like a compass needle directly toward the opposite shore of the lake. And sitting right in the center of the kayak's plastic seat was a single wet, smooth lake stone. "Did you move this last night?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "No," I whispered, scanning the gray fog over the water. "I didn't touch it." The wind hadn't blown last night. The lake had been as smooth as glass. Someone had come onto our dock while we were inside the cabin, repositioned our gear, left a marker, and slipped back into the water without making a sound. We decided right then that we were leaving. But packing took time, and by the time we had secured our bags and cleared out the kitchen, a violent summer thunderstorm had rolled in, dropping torrential rain and bringing pitch-black darkness by 9 p.m. The gravel road leading out was prone to severe mudslides, and I knew driving 7 miles through a flash flood in total darkness was dangerous. We made the foolish mistake of deciding to sleep until 4 a.m. and leave at the first sight of daylight. We turned off every single light in the cabin. We locked both doors, pulled every curtain shut, and lay on top of the bed in our clothes, waiting for morning. At 11:30 p.m., I crept over to the bedroom window and parted the curtain by a fraction of an inch. Through the heavy rain, I saw the light on the far shore. Same position, same intense narrow beam. Then as I watched, the light began to move. It didn't move left or right along the bank. It began to slide downward, descending the slope of the opposite shore until it reached the edge of the lake. Then the light entered the water. It moved slowly, steadily, in a straight, unbroken line across the quarter-mile of black, stormy water. It wasn't bouncing like someone swimming. It was gliding effortlessly, slow, methodical, and relentless, straight toward our dock. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice choking with terror. "Get in the closet. Now." She didn't argue. She scrambled into the small hallway closet and pulled the door shut. I stood in the pitch-black bedroom, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the heavy metal flashlight I'd grabbed from my nightstand. 10 minutes passed. The only sound was the heavy thudding of rain against the cedar roof. Then I heard it. Thud. A heavy, wet impact against the wooden pilings of our dock. I held my breath, feeling the blood drain from my face. Step, step, step. Bare, wet feet slowly walking up the wooden planks of the dock toward the cabin deck. The footsteps reached the sliding glass door just outside our bedroom. Then, total silence for 20 agonizing seconds. Tap, tap, tap. 3 gentle, deliberate knuckles knocking against the glass pane of the sliding door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stood in the center of the dark room, tears of pure horror running down my face, praying that whatever was standing on that wet deck wouldn't shatter the glass. After 2 long minutes, the knocking stopped. I heard the wet, dragging sound of footsteps moving away from the door, heading down the wooden steps and back into the lake. Then, a faint, rhythmic splashing sound that slowly faded into the distance as they crossed back into the dark water. We didn't wait until 4 a.m. We ran out the front door, slammed into our SUV, and drove through the blinding rainstorm, skidding through mudslideways until we reached the paved highway. When I called the property management company the next afternoon to report what had happened, the manager listened in dead silence. When I finished, she cleared her throat. "Sir," she said quietly, "the land on the opposite shore of that lake is a protected state wildlife refuge. There are no roads, no trails, and no structures within 15 miles of that bank. No one has permission to be over there. She promised to send a team to inspect the cabin, but we never heard back from them again. A week later, out of pure obsession, I sat down at my computer and spent hours digging through online rental reviews for that specific cabin. Scrolling back 4 months prior to our trip, I found a review left by a couple from Illinois. It read, "Beautiful cabin, but we ended up leaving 2 days early. Every night around 11:30 p.m. there was a strange light on the far shore of the lake that felt like it was tracking us. On our last night, we heard someone walking up on the dock at midnight. Do not stay here alone." Whoever was across that water didn't just target us. They had been living in those forbidden woods for months, maybe years, watching family after family come and go, learning the layout of the cabin, learning when people went to sleep. And every single night, when the lake went black, they crossed the open water to see just how close they could get. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many times have you been out in the quiet, tucked away in some cozy cabin, completely oblivious to the eyes watching you from the edge of the tree line? If you enjoyed tonight's stories, please hit that like button and unsubscribe to Midnight Narrative. Your support is what keeps the lights on, or in our case, keeps the lights off. Don't forget to drop a comment down below with your thoughts on tonight's tales, or share your own personal terrifying experiences. I read every single one, and some of your submissions might even be featured in a future video. Thank you so much for spending your night with me. Stay safe out there, lock your doors, and I'll see you again next time on Midnight Narrative. Good night.